Hello there, welcome back. This is Project Embryo, a sci-fi survival horror game in virtual reality inspired by classic genre titles. Last time we met, I had completed the majority of the game environment, including VFXs and environmental interactions. There is still much to do, but first I'd like to try and optimize what has been created so far. The performance in the initial test was not impressive. The game was running at a frame rate that fluctuated between 45 and 90 FPS. For a standard game, this frame rate might be acceptable, but as you may know, this is a virtual reality title and VR demands higher performance. While 60 FPS is the minimum, I am aiming for 120, especially considering a potential transfer to Oculus Quest 3 in the future. Let's then explore all the changes that I made to reach it. To surpass it, in fact. Currently each frame takes about 5 milliseconds, which corresponds to roughly 200 FPS. It's an increase of almost 120%. Let's start with the basics. Epic suggests switching from deferred to forward rendering when working in VR. What is forward rendering? In brief, it's a rendering pipeline that is sometimes faster, but is also less flexible and more prone to frame rate drops in the presence of multiple light sources. Initially, I tried switching to forward rendering, but alas, its limitations were too much for me. Notice all this shimmering that happens due to the anti-aliasing, and also these black spots that are a result of the way fog is calculated in forward rendering. So I reverted back to deferred rendering. So, let's see what actually can be trimmed. By activating Stat Unit, we can see various components of the game and their millisecond consumption, more critical than FPSs. Currently, the GPU is the bottleneck, so graphics optimization is necessary. Typing stat GPU in the command panel revealed that dynamic shadows and volumetric fogs were the major offenders. Sadly, not much could be done about dynamic shadow. I had to remove them. An horror game without dynamic shadow it's really a shame, but the aesthetic still works well, I think. For volumetric fog, though, it was a more complex issue. By heavily lowering its quality and tweaking some parameters, I reduced its cost to almost zero, leaving the scene almost unchanged. In fact, due to the way I calculate lighting, the fog doesn't sample from every light, it just samples from this volumetric light map, this grid of spheres that are equally distributed in the level. And if I increase the detail of the volumetric fog to a smaller distance, a smaller amount of samples than those of those spheres, the quality isn't actually improved, but the cost is increased exponentially. So lowering the fog density, lowering the fog sample density, doesn't actually decrease the quality. It just improves the render time exponentially. Once I decided the settings that worked fine for me, I then saved them in command lines that I execute every time I start the level. They are saved here in the level blueprint. The last of these command lines that I apply is the activation of round-robin occlusion. Occlusion decides which meshes are visible and which aren't. For VR with two cameras, this can cause issues because each eye sees a different thing. Round-robin occlusion only considers one eye per frame, alternating them, and this halves the computational load. After having done all that, we can move away from graphics and into more complex tasks. The most significant one was implementing level streaming, which is to say I divided the level into small sub-levels that are loaded as we move, keeping the entire level from being constantly in memory. This not only improves memory, but also the culling cost of choosing every frame which objects are visible and which aren't. Since much of the level isn't loaded anyway, these meshes will never be visible, and therefore they aren't considered when the computer does the calculation. Enemies remain active throughout the level, because in the future I would like them to move freely across the map. However, distant enemies disappear, replaced by a proxy that moves randomly without heavy AI or graphics. Grabbable objects also stay loaded, allowing the player to move them around the level without having them disappear. To prevent them from falling into the void when the supporting surface vanishes, I made them stop simulating physics after a few seconds of immobility, resuming only when they are hit by the player or other objects. Finally, I optimized animations, which were among the heaviest GPU tasks. This involved creating LODs, which are simple versions seen from a distance of the enemies, that have some of the animation parts turned off, and additionally I made sure that various animations, both from enemies and from the environment, are calculated only when they are in the player view, and also distant enemy now update every 2 or 3 frames instead of every frame. Thanks to these adjustments, the game now runs quite well, though there is always room for improvement. For instance, I'm considering exploring Blueprint nativization, that transforms Blueprint into C++ during packaging. This promises significant performance gains, but I'm concerned about reported bugs. It has even been removed in Unreal Engine 5, so the feature appears to be so buggy that Unreal discontinued it. We'll see how it goes. In this video, I also aimed to enhance and complete the AI of enemies. Before these changes, they would attack if the player was visible, and once lost from sight, they would search for a while and then return to their business. Let's start with making the interaction with this creature a little more dynamic. First, let's allow them to hear sound. Until now they only reacted to gunshots, but I introduced a sound emitting component that enables objects to emit sound. Unreal already has its AI sight and hearing system, but I prefer having 100% control, and also I don't want to learn nothing new, so I will write it from scratch. The fact that enemies can now hear us is a double-edged sword. We can distract them by throwing objects, even if it currently backfires quite easily. But it also means that we can be heard when walking fast, for example. To encourage stealth, the player doesn't emit sounds when they walk slowly. While the player might understand it from the footstep sound, a proper explanation, perhaps through some audio logs, might be needed. Now that the enemies have more tools to detect the player, it seemed like a good idea to give the player new ones as well. We can now throw objects at enemies and stun them. The damage is minimal, and it generally depends on the force of the throw and the weight of the object. However, if we use the grab chain to hold objects, these effects are significantly nerfed. Doing this is free, and it would be a bit too overpowered if not actively discouraged. Lastly, while the enemies previously relied only on sound and hearing, they now have a sort of a sense of touch. If you get too close, they will perceive you regardless. You are practically touching them after all. With these two additions, I decided to work on the last crucial aspect of the general AI for my enemies: blindness. From the beginning I envisioned some enemies as blind, and I wanted the player to be able to blind the enemies by destroying their head. With the latest changes, blind enemies finally exhibit a different behavior. Obviously, they can't see you, and so they are more responsive to sounds. Once they become suspicious due to a sound, they will attack the empty space, and then continue to roam around and attack at random. If by chance they get close to you during their random attack, they will notice your presence and attack you. Every damage you take emits a sound, so that simulates the fact that the enemy, by hitting you, understands your position and continues to attack it. If the creature misses a hit while you move slowly, you will have a chance to disappear then and avoid being found. Alternatively, you could try to escape, perhaps by slipping into a place that it can't reach. From this behavior can arise some interesting emergent strategies. I feel a bit guilty about spoiling one, but I will do anyway. Since blind enemies attack the zone where they heard a sound, throwing an object near a blind enemy will lead the blind enemy to attack. This way, they can deal friendly fire to other nearby enemies. If the victim can see, it won't respond to the attack, because it will recognize it as friendly fire. But if the victim is also blind, well, I will let you discover that. And that's it for tonight, friends. See you in the next video.